I'd just like to welcome you to this lecture this evening and to say thank you very much sincerely for getting here tonight. We thought long and hard today about whether we should cancel this lecture with the weather being so inclement in many different areas, but we had some reasonable feedback and it's really pleasing to see so many of you here tonight. I'd just like to say as well, this is our last public lecture of the year, and we will be having a little glass of wine and a mince pie afterwards, so I hope you'll be able to stay for a little while and partake in that after the lecture. Before we start, if I could ask if you could turn your mobile phones off, not just because of the embarrassment of it might go off, it's just that when we're filming, it does actually affect the filming apparently, so it's better if they're turned off rather than on silent. Need to make an announcement about the fire alarms. If the fire alarm goes, if you can make your way through the back door from where you enter the room and back down the stairways and out into the courtyard. If the fire should happen to be there, which we hope it won't be, there's an alternative route this way which staff will guide us through, and the screen does go up so we can get through there. But we hope that won't happen tonight. The ladies' and gentlemen's cloakrooms are on the ground floor. Unfortunately, we haven't got any up here. Again, back down the stairs and turn left at the bottom, and they're on the left-hand side. And just want to draw your attention to forthcoming events. We have on Monday night, and we hope the weather's not going to be as bad as it is today, we're trialling a new event, a bit of a Café Scientifique event on Monday evening, which will be discussion. It's a discussion, a more intimate discussion, less numbers than we have at these public lectures, and it will be held in the cafe area outside. Dr. Philip Ball is going to talk about music, entitled Music Instinct. He will look at how our minds understand and respond to music and why it can excite deep passions, is how he describes it. So if anybody's interested in joining us on Monday, I think there's a few more tickets left. Lucy, or I'll speak to myself or Lucy, tall Lucy, that's usually at the back, and we'll put you down for Monday. And then our first public lecture in January is on Thursday the 6th of January. And you've probably seen outside there's an advertisement called Sex and the City, The Emerging Role of Human Skin. And this is going to be given by Dr. Paul Matz. Our first 3 public lectures in 2011 are actually going to be themed on the human body, but we will be sort of varying the topics. So hope to see many of you there, and it'll be the normal booking system online. So on to this evening. I'd like to very much give a warm welcome to our chair for this evening, Professor Don Mottram, who comes from the University of Reading, although he's very stalwartly come down from Bristol today and managed to get here in one piece, which is great. And he is a Professor of Food Chemistry there. He has over 160 publications in flavour chemistry and food science. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry and is an active member of our food group, it says here, but yes. And in 2003, I'm delighted to say that the Royal Society of Chemistry awarded him a medal for food chemistry. So I don't think we could have had a better qualified chairman for the evening, and I'll hand over to Professor Mottram. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Great to see you all here this evening on such a miserable evening. I'm sure, though, it's going to be worthwhile. We're going to have a very interesting talk. What a good topic just before Christmas. Nuts and Christmas. So isn't it a wonderful place in the centre of London to have a meeting? This beautiful building, and I'm so impressed the way that the chemistry centre has been put together. It's 2 or 3 years since I came up to to Burlington House, and it's so nice to see the library being used in an evening in this sort of way. So that's very nice. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening to you. Professor Clare Mills is from the Institute of Food Research, where she's research leader for the Food Structure and Health Group. She's worked at IFR for a number of years, having done her degrees in Bristol and a PhD in Kent. Clare's expertise is in biophysical properties of proteins and their relationship to the structural properties of food. She leads programs looking at the behaviour of proteins during digestion, and the relationship to health and well-being. This includes food allergies, and she leads a major European research project on food allergies covering over 60 partners. I've known Claire for a number of years, and we've met at a number of meetings. I have got a publication from which I received more emails than any other publication, and Claire is in the same publication, and that was Waitrose Food magazine. We both have our photographs in that magazine. I don't know whether you had the same experience, Claire. More people contact me over that than any of my other publications. But to return to our subject tonight of allergies, we're all familiar with the allergies that affect our well-being, affect some people more than others. Many of us have suffered Hayfever and other allergies that irritate the nose and make you feel difficult. But although many of us don't have allergies to specific foods, we probably all know somebody who has got a specific food allergy. And Claire, this evening, will explain the structural and biological properties of food proteins that give rise to such allergic reactions. And as we approach the festive season with its abundance of delicious foods, I think the topic of tonight's talk is most appropriate. Thus, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Clare Mills to give her talk, Nuts About Christmas. Claire.
Thank you very much, Don, for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to be in such a wonderful venue, and just going around and seeing busts of people like Davy and the great chemists we've had in the past. It is a great honour, actually, to come and speak to you today. So, nuts about Christmas. What is all the fuss about? When I was a child at school, I'd never heard of anybody with a peanut allergy, let alone all these different sorts of tree nuts. And it's about 15 years ago or so that it really began to appear with terrible headlines and tragic consequences of people eating very small amounts of particularly peanuts that became into the headlines. And it's given the impression that food allergy is actually a new disease, but actually it isn't. And it's interesting that one of the first descriptions of an adverse reaction to food actually comes from the writings of Hippocrates, who recognized cow's milk allergy in infants. So it has been around for a while, but it doesn't seem to have had presented so many problems as it does today. I think there's also a lot of confusion about food allergies. And one of the questions I often get, well, allergies and food intolerance, aren't they the same sort of thing? And something that I found quite useful in giving me a kind of rational framework to understand all of this is this classification which came from the work of the European Academy of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. And what you have up at the top is adverse reactions to food. So this is really very broad. You know, you eat something and you're ill, and you can clearly have toxic reactions, or it could be salmonella or something like that. But what we're talking about are non-toxic reactions, and what the Academy classified them into was two different sorts: immune-mediated and non-immune-mediated. And they classified these two differently and said, well, the non-immune-mediated ones are food intolerance, and the ones that include the immune system or involve the immune system, we're going to call those food allergies. And under the food intolerance, you then have enzymatic, ones that have an enzymatic basis, and that's things like lactose intolerance, where people eat dairy products, and because they lack the enzyme that can hydrolyze lactose, they get all sorts of gastrointestinal problems, and often they're the same sort of symptoms as somebody might get from an immune-mediated allergy, but it has a different cause. There can also be pharmacological reactions. For example, some people react to histamine-containing foods, or there does appear to be compounds in certain foods like chocolates and cheese that can bring on migraines. So they all come into this non-immune one. But I'm going to talk to you tonight about immune-mediated food allergy. And within this, there are two types. And of the non-IgE-mediated, the classic one is the gluten intolerance syndrome, celiac disease. And there's very strong evidence that that, to some extent, involves the cellular arm of the immune system. But the other aspect relates to this molecule, immunoglobulin E, which is a normal antibody that you produce. And you normally produce it if you have a parasitic infection. So if you went and got the blood of someone who had malaria, they have huge levels of IgE, and it's directed towards the parasite and is part of the body's defense against it. What triggers an allergic reaction? So this molecule IgE is very, very important. We don't really understand why some people suddenly start producing IgE to environmental agents like pollens, as Don mentioned, with Hayfever, or why some people produce them to food. And it's actually at a much lower level, but it is specific. And the antibodies, because they're like any other antibodies, there's a specific molecular recognition. And it binds to a molecule, the allergen, which is generally speaking a protein. And it's that interaction between those two, the IgE and the protein molecule, the allergen, that actually causes the allergic reaction. For it to happen, the allergen has to have more than one IgE binding site. So you can see here, there's the allergen, it comes in, it binds to two IgE molecules. When it does that, and those IgE molecules are sitting on the surface, bound to the plasma membrane of a cell called a mast cell or a basophil that's packed full of histamine-containing granules, it triggers a whole change in that cell, and it releases all the mediators. Histamine is an important one, but there are others. And it's actually those mediators that go on to cause the symptoms that people experience as an allergic reaction, like rashes, wheezing, and vomiting, and so on. So the symptoms of allergy can be quite varied. And I think what's a real puzzle with food allergy is it can manifest itself in a number of ways. So it can be quite difficult if you've eaten something and then suddenly you come out on a skin rash. This is very counterintuitive. Another one is people having wheezing and so on. I think it's kind of make the connection between food and being sick or having diarrhea, it's a bit easier. But the respiratory and the skin reactions are quite diverse. And of course, there are some people who have very severe reactions, particularly anaphylactic ones. And I think this is what drives an awful lot of the fear. If you've had a severe reaction, it is very scary. And I think it's one of the remarkable things about people who have anaphylactic type reactions is that often these people have a sense of impending doom before anything else. Even before they feel anything in their mouth, they've started to eat something and somehow their body knows. And I think this is just incredible. And how quickly this whole set of symptoms, and particularly there is a real problem with the swelling of the throat and mouth and loss of blood pressure, and I can't remember whether I've got it, severe asthma. And often they don't, if you go to A&E, they do not necessarily connect severe asthma attacks with an anaphylactic reaction, and there are clinical issues over how this is managed. And it is actually these severe reactions that cause a lot of fear, and their unpredictable nature, because sometimes people have maybe just had a mild reaction, and then suddenly they start having very severe reactions unexpectedly. And this is just an analysis that was done by a fantastic lady called Hazel Garland, who's been a pioneer in terms of representing allergic patients, and a clinician now retired from Manchester, Richard Pumphrey. And they did a survey of fatal reactions to foods in the UK. What's amazing is that more than 50% were in this age group, 11 to 30. if you're over 60 or 70, you're much less likely to be allergic to anything. And more than 50% had previously mild reactions. So it has a very unpredictable nature. What was of great concern, and this was done in 2007, so we have had labelling regulations which may have made it easier for allergic consumers to avoid foods, was that greater than 30% of the deaths were caused by catered or pre-packed foods. And you can see here there are several that were caused by whole nuts. So, with that kind of note of concern, how many people does it actually affect? And if you go around and ask people, and people have done this, there are sometimes even reports of 30% of the population having a food allergy, and I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, although it is true that probably around 30% of the UK population suffer from some type of allergy. We have a lot of allergic asthma, we have a lot of hay fever, dust mite allergy, and so on. But we actually lacked the data for food allergies, and this was why we got the money for doing the EuroPrevall project, which, although it says 4 years and 7 months here, I think it's been more like 7 years of my life, actually, from writing it, where we got this amazing project with 63 partners from 23 countries, all over Europe, Africa, Asia, India and China, collaborators from North America and Australia. And this project's aim was to fill that gap so we could actually find out how many people had got food allergy. And that's important because if the allergy rates are changing, we need this as baseline data to go back and find out in the future. And what we did was we had, because allergies have different incidences depending on age. So what we had was a birth cohort, and this is led by a lady called Kirsten Bayer in Berlin. And the idea there was to get data on infants and young children up to the age of 2.5 years. We then had community surveys, which were coordinated by Peter Burney here in Imperial College in London, and that was run in school-age children and in adults. And then finally, because when you do epidemiology, you often don't end up with much of a cohort, we wanted a big cohort of people with food allergies to study. We had an outpatient clinic study, which was led by Montserrat Fernandez-Rivas in Madrid. And you will see many of the countries involved in the different studies were the same, in the same centres. We were also very lucky in then getting additional money to bring in studies and to look in Russia, China and India. And here we also had a dimension of looking at rural versus urban populations in Mysore and Bangalore, in Hong Kong, and we've also had the study run in Guangzhou and Beijing, and in Tomsk in Western Siberia. And that's been fantastic in providing us with new information. So we actually finished a year ago, but they have only just finished cleaning our databases because there are thousands and thousands of records. But the preliminary data indicate that in the birth cohort, we have a very big difference in the rate of food allergy. So in Athens, they have hardly any food allergy. It's down at less than 0.5% in infants. But if you go to Amsterdam, the clinics are run off their feet and they have so many babies, it's between 6 and 10%. And this had been always a puzzle that people had been publishing incidences of food allergy and were saying, well, somebody over here says it's 1%, somebody over here says it's 10%, and as a scientist you start thinking, well, this is all a bit dodgy. But actually, it's real, and there is a great heterogeneity. And what's also been remarkable, and was remarkable for me coming from the UK, where peanut allergy is always seen as a problem, in Athens there was not a single child with peanut allergy. In fact, the statisticians don't like that because it screws all the calculations up. So that's the infants and young children. But what's been interesting is when we look in the adults and the school-age children, we see much the same sort of pattern. And in the east of Europe, the incidence appears to be an awful lot lower than it is in many other westernized European countries. And it really does seem to suggest that there are issues about increases in allergy that are associated with lifestyle and environmental changes. When we take, and we've used exactly the same study protocols in all those centres, and then when we went to India, well, and this guy who's run the study in India, fantastic, 30,000 subjects, hardly any allergy. He felt very disappointed. And Peter Burney said, no, but this is brilliant, because when you go to Hong Kong, Hong Kong is like London. It's high. So there are real heterogeneities in the incidence of allergies. And this makes it a big challenge, actually, for us to manage. Because what somebody is allergic to in China may be different to the allergies in Athens, which may be different to the ones in the UK. So which foods are important? So we're getting data on how many people are, and it certainly seems to be about 2% of adult population, but it's an awful lot higher in infants and young children, and it varies. So I'd always thought we would get one number out of this, and I've learnt to my cost that we're not going to get one number. We've got a range, and it's quite diverse. Which foods are important? Well, out of all of this study, and I've highlighted here the ones that are nuts, these are the top allergens that we will find in Europe. First of all is hazelnut. This will be, beyond anything else in the whole of Europe, the most important allergen. Then apple, walnut and peanut. We also have in infants and children, I should say, and it is primarily infants and children, egg and milk. But we also have things like apple, peach, and interestingly enough, kiwi fruit. And we have similar trends in our epidemiology study and our outpatient surveys. So we feel fairly certain that these are the most important foods. And it does confirm what has been gone on to the labelling directive about allergenic ingredients that people need to avoid. So this just emphasises the difference between adults and children. So here you can see egg and milk. Under 3 years is the purple bars, and you can see we've got far more egg and milk allergic children. These are the number of adults. We have some fish, but when you come to adults and older children, suddenly you see hazelnut and apple and peach coming in, and they're really, really low in the children. And the patterns vary with geography. So, for example, hazelnut allergy, we didn't see much of it in Spain or Bulgaria. Celeriac allergy, well, I'd never heard of it. This is why, if you look on allergen labelling packs, it's got celery on there. What it really is celeriac, and it's a real problem in places like Switzerland and Poland and parts of Germany. But we don't see it, the Icelanders and the Spanish don't, and they don't see it in Bulgaria either. If you come to shrimp allergy, actually that's really much, much more frequent in countries like Iceland, Greece and Spain. And shrimp and crab and lobster were really important allergens in Hong Kong. We don't really understand why, except that this does in some way relate to patterns of consumption. So going back to my title, I thought, well, peanuts about Christmas? So I'm going to tell you a tale of two allergens now, focused around some of the work that we've been doing on peanuts. And these are some fantastic pictures that were taken by a researcher from IFR, a human geographer, who went to rural Ghana. And it just brings home to you the world of peanuts, because peanuts are a really important food in rural Ghana. It is the weaning food of choice because of the protein content. And this is the peanut processing, the women in the village separating the oil. And this is what is used in cooking. And it's everywhere. And when Annabelle asked them about peanut allergy, they said, well, if anybody's allergic to peanut here, they're just going to be dead. But it may well be, and I'm not going to talk about it today, but there's a very famous study funded by the UK Food Standards Agency, being led by a clinician here in London at King's College called Gideon Lack, where they're actually trying to introduce peanut into vulnerable groups at an early age, because one of the questions is, actually, maybe the Ghanaians have something to teach us. that maybe introducing peanuts early in life every day could help to prevent allergies, and we're all waiting to see what Gideon's results tell us. So this is a map of the peanut kernel proteins. It's run on something called two-dimensional SDS page, so we separated the protein components of peanuts by charge up across the top and size down here. And here we have positively charged proteins, here we have negatively charged proteins. And you can see there's lots and lots of different components within a peanut. But some of those molecules cause allergies. And I'm going to introduce you now to two of them. And because that's the allergen community, they've given these proteins names, and they have allergen nomenclature, and it's based on the Latin name Arachis hypergea 1. And this is actually the seeds, one of the seed storage globulins of peanut. It's also called conarachin, and it represents almost 25% of the protein in a peanut seed. And it's a very big, as protein molecules go, it's a big one, and it's got 3 different subunits you can see coloured here. Allergen number 2, which it should say 2, my apologies there, ARA-H2 and 6, is a small molecule. It's not so abundant, and it's also called a peanut 2S albumin. And to give you some idea of how big this part of the molecule is, it's about the equivalent of that, slightly smaller. And this is showing you the annotation of that. So this up here, this splurge on the gel here is ARA-H1, and our ARA-H2 and 6 is here. So you can see this is much, much more abundant than our ARA-H2 and 6. But abundance doesn't actually account for allergenic potency. And this is a study we did in our EuroPrevall project using human allergic sera. And we actually have found that an awful lot of people who have peanut allergy are actually, their IgE, the molecules that you remember cause the allergies, they develop IgE to ARA-H2/6 predominantly. And there is a lot of data now to point to this molecule being the most potent peanut allergen. Although in some patients they do seem to recognize the ARA-H1. So just because a protein is very abundant in a food doesn't seem to be diagnostic of whether it becomes an allergen or not. So what are the other things that might affect it? Oh, before I go on to that, this is just showing not just the IgE binding, but we have a method to actually measure how effective an allergen is in releasing histamine. So this is histamine up the side here, and these are, so this is micrograms, so that's 10 to the minus 6 millionths of grams. And can you see how much? 0.0001. We're down in nanograms, 10 to the minus 9 thousand millionths of grams. And this is our ARA-H2 and our ARA-H6. And ARA-H6, even down here at the lowest concentration they used, it still causes histamine to be released from somebody's cells. So that tells you how tiny amounts of this protein could cause an allergic reaction, whereas our ARA-H1 in this patient is down here. It's still pretty good at triggering histamine release, but nowhere near as potent as our ARA-H2 and 6. So something else that people have been puzzled about is cooking. Well, how does cooking affect allergens in foods? Because we know that cooking affects the structure and the shape of molecules, and that's just like if you boil an egg, the egg white goes cloudy and sets, and that's because you've heated it up, and the molecules, the protein molecules in that egg white have changed their shape and they interact, and it gives you instead of it being sort of liquid, it sets. So how does that affect the allergens? So allergen number 1, our ARA-H1, that very big molecule. Actually, when you heat it up, and this is heating it above 90 degrees C, this is something called a CD spectrum, and it gives us a measure of how much of the molecule shape there is. And the green line shows us the CD spectrum for the native protein, and the red line shows us the spectrum for the heated protein. And this change is indicative of all that nice, neat, folded structure has unfolded and it's changed its shape. And we've got a wonderful technique in IFR called atomic force microscopy, which I love because it actually feels molecules. It's a bit like a record player arm that runs across the molecules and gives you an idea about their shape. And this is an atomic force micrograph of the unheated protein. And the dimensions of this are about 1 nanometer by 1 nanometer, and that's about what we'd expect for this big protein. But when we've heated it up here, they become absolutely huge, and some of them are like 600. So they're 600 times as big as the unheated protein. And in actual fact, a bit like the egg white, this protein will form a gel. So when you heat up egg white and you get that solid white gel, that's exactly what this peanut protein can do. And when we look to see how that affected the IgE binding, and this was done on a chip with BBC Genomics, and we've got here bars. The two pale bars are the unheated protein, and the orange and the darker orange bars are the heated protein. And what was interesting is that there are some people, you heat the protein up and it makes no difference, their IgE still recognizes it. There are other people who the heating has destroyed the IgE binding. And then what was most significant was that in some other people, you heat it up and actually the IgE binding increased. So this shows us how complicated allergies are. So sometimes you might cook your peanuts and the allergy decreases, some of it doesn't change, and then there are some people who might actually be more allergic to a cooked peanut than a raw peanut. So now we begin to understand how complicated this is for people with allergies. And when we put it into our cell assay that measures how much of that histamine gets released, we see exactly the same sort of thing. So here's our ARA-H1. It's not been heated, and when it's been heated, we find that some people, their serum didn't actually cause any histamine release with the raw protein. When it had been heated, they did recognize it, and they did react to it. So histamine release increased with ARA-H1 in many patients, but for our ARA-H26, we got a different story. And it either didn't change, or in some cases it decreased. So how does our ARA-H26, our small molecule, respond to being heated up? Well, this protein's a different kettle of fish. This is a very tough protein. And in fact, we actually had to heat it up to over 110 degrees C. So this is our CD spectrum again, and this shows that it's a nice, folded, neat protein. When we heated it up for either 15 or 60 minutes, and this might be the equivalent of how the Ghanaians process their peanuts, it becomes completely unfolded. So it's denatured. But unlike our first molecule, our big molecule, the ARA-H1, it doesn't form great big molecular aggregates. It doesn't form something like egg white gel. It does change its shape. So this is the size of the native protein. This is after it's been heated, and it's a mixture of monomers and possibly dimers and some larger oligomers, but they're still small. They're still, in fact, these ones are only about the size of our ARA-H1 before it's been heated. So what happens with the IgE binding here? And this shows, here's the IgE binding of a number of patients to our unheated ARA-H26. We heat it up with and without glucose, and the IgE binding decreases. And then what our French collaborators did was actually they got some ARA-H26 out of some roasted nuts. And actually the ARA-H26 from the roasted nuts behaves just like the stuff that hasn't been heated. And when we checked, yes, it still had that native structure. So this protein doesn't get destroyed very well by cooking procedures. This is just more data showing that the IgE binding of very, very heavily heated ARA-H26 does decrease but by and large, the stuff in peanuts is completely resistant to processing. So we've got two molecules, both able to cause allergic reactions, but they respond in different ways. And our ARA-H1 is a big protein that unfolds and aggregates at high temperatures, and in some cases the Ig binding goes up, in other times it goes down. This molecule is really, really tough and doesn't actually get affected at all by the same temperatures as our ARA-H1, and that might contribute to its being very potent as an allergen. There's another part of this story which is to do with how it behaves in the human body during digestion. And what's interesting here, this is our ARA-H1, and this is a simulated gastric digestion, and we've separated the protein. So here's the protein to start off with. It's quite big, molecular weight of about 60 kilodaltons, 60,000 daltons, very rapidly broken down to very small peptides down here after 120 minutes, which is about the time it takes if you had a meal for that to empty out. And what we did some years ago was show, here's our native ARA-H1, and this is back to that assay where we check the cells to see if they can release histamine. ARA-H1, again, very low levels, you get histamine release. If we digest it, so that's this material here, no difference. And actually, if we subject it to gastroduodenal digestion, no difference at all. So even though we've digested it, it appears its allergenicity doesn't get altered very much, and that's very unusual. We then have our ARA-H26, and this is tough again. It gets digested by gastric conditions, but you can see here, at the end of the stomach digestion, we've got two big parts of the molecule that are completely unaffected. And when we take it through a duodenal digestion, this is a bit diluted compared to this one, but it's the same. And it looks like there's a big core of the protein structure here that completely resists digestion. So these two things, this molecule falls apart but keeps a lot of its allergenicity, but ARA-H26 is really, really tough and does keep a digestion-resistant core. So you can see we can explain a lot of the differences in the allergenicity of these molecules based on what we know about the structure. That's probably why peanuts, because it's got that ARA-H26 in there, maybe that's one of the reasons why peanuts are such a potent allergenic food. So one of the other questions that we often have to think about in terms of managing allergens, and this is a question that was posed by a guy called Steve Taylor at the University of Nebraska many years ago. How much is too much? And those headlines where somebody's had a reaction from eating a tiny amount. And I've also seen people who've had reactions when they've been kissed by someone who's been eating their problem food. And that's led to legislation to help allergic consumers avoid the foods that they are allergic to. And this has been good because it means if an allergenic ingredient is added to a food deliberately as part of the recipe, it's got to be on the label. But we've still got what they call precautionary labelling. And I must admit, you read some of these and it's very bewildering. It's like when you've got a bag of peanuts and you turn it over and it says may contain nuts. It's kind of crazy. But what does that mean? And how do you manage it very effectively? Well, something that we need to do is to get information on how much people react to and how much allergen they might get accidentally into a food to actually define whether they're likely to have a probability of an allergic reaction. And the industry need to know that, because if you can imagine you're making chocolate bars and one day you're making chocolate bars that don't have any peanut on, and then you go and put peanut in it, and then you go back to the non-peanut containing one, and sometimes it's very difficult in factories to clean it down effectively, and you end up with tiny amounts of peanut going into the non-peanut containing chocolate. So if we get the right sort of information about how much people react to, how much there might be in that supposedly peanut-free chocolate, can we define what the likelihood of an allergic reaction is? And that will help the manufacturers to know, do I need to change my process so I make it cleaner? actually, have I got a little bit in there, but it's not going to cause an allergic reaction, so I don't need to put anything on the label? Or is there genuinely a problem, and yes, I do need to warn the allergic consumer? Because at the moment, we don't have this clearly worked out. The industry don't know. The clinicians don't know. And it's very difficult for the clinicians to give their allergic patients really good advice. And some of them tell them to avoid it, and actually some of them say, well, if you've been eating it and it's okay, carry on. And you see the manufacturers going a pale shade thinking, oh my goodness. So one of the things we did in EuroPrevall was to actually find out, and to find out how much causes an allergic reaction, you feed it to an allergic patient. And I think the people who go through these procedures are really brave. And you can imagine you're a mum with a baby with cow's milk allergy. Are you going to want your baby to do this? But we have been really fortunate, and we've had a lot of people who've been prepared to do this, to collect this information. And we've done it with babies and baby's milk, a dessert, chocolate bars, and shrimp burgers. And this is just to give you some idea of the sorts of things we see. So subjective symptoms, this will be somebody can feel itching or tingling in the mouth. And the sort of thing, the dose that affects 5% or 10%, you can see 0.03 milligrams of protein starts getting someone with the tingling. And one of the things we've been very fortunate in EuroPrevall is that we've been able to carry on. So you've got some itching, okay, so long as the patient's happy, they carry on eating the next bit of the dose, so that we can actually challenge them until they get objective symptoms. And what we're trying to do is set up data analysis at the moment that allows us to link, if you started off with a subjective symptom and it progresses and you start getting objective symptoms like a rash or asthma, or actually for some of the babies they were actually physically sick, you can see it's a lot higher to get the objective symptoms. And these are the things that you're really trying to protect people from, but it may be that this is also giving us a clue about the beginning of that allergic reaction. We also don't know, going back to one of my first slides about anaphylaxis, and this is a very big uncertainty. You might have had a mild reaction, you might have just had the itching in your mouth, and you might have had to eat quite a bit for that. But the next time, what's going to give you a severe reaction? And this is something that we still need to actually find out. And whether there are other factors that are also involved. There are a lot of reports of people who have allergic reactions when they go to restaurants. So is it alcohol, exercise, infections? Certainly poorly controlled asthma is a big indicator for getting severe allergy reactions when you have a food allergy. So if you have a food allergy and you've got asthma, you must take your medication for your asthma because it makes a big difference to your safety. We've also found out, and this is going back some years ago, a study done by Jonathan Hurricane and Kate Grimshaw at Southampton, where they actually Kate changed the matrix because she said people can still taste the peanut in this, so she added more fat. She actually put Trex into chocolate, so to any confectioner this is probably horrendous. They actually had to stop the study because they'd had 4 challenges and Jonathan had been called because they were getting really severe reactions. And what they found was that 3 out of 4 subjects challenged, they actually had to eat more of the food, but when they did eat it and they suddenly got a reaction, it was a really, really bad one. And there's something about fatty matrix that affects the way those allergen molecules come out of the food. And it may well be our H26, that really tough small molecule, doesn't come out of fatty foods very easily, and that it may actually have to be digested in the stomach a bit more. And we've done some work in EuroPrevall using hazelnut, and we've shown exactly the same thing. So although the amounts may not need to be a lot higher in chocolate, they can cause much more severe reactions. So I hope I've shown you we've developed an awful lot more knowledge over the last 5 years that can help us, I think, develop much better transparent knowledge-based strategies to avoid using lots of these precautionary labels. We've got more knowledge about the molecules causing allergies. That will help us get better diagnosis, and potentially it might even lead to new approaches to cure allergies, and certainly there are a lot of people trying to work on it. And that ultimately is done with the goal of allowing consumers to make safe choices. There have been an awful lot of people who've been involved in this project, the clinical partners, the allergen molecule people, Charlotte Madsen, who did a great job with the horizontal integration, and not least the IFR team, Alan Mackey, who led the project with me, and the researchers, Neil Rigby, Louise Salt, Phil Johnson, Juicy Mandalari, and Anna Sancho, who's now in Salzburg, who actually did the research work. And last but not least, 63 partners, 150 people, and all those thousands and thousands of allergic individuals who participated in our studies, filled in our questionnaires, gave us blood samples, and so on. We couldn't have done it without them, and actually it was for them in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire, for an absolutely fascinating lecture. I'm sure there are going to be a number of questions. Now, you're perhaps aware that these lectures are being simultaneously broadcast on the Royal Society of Chemistry website and will be recorded there. So when you ask your question, would you please stand up, give your name, your affiliation, and speak into the microphone, because otherwise the people who are not in the room today, many of whom I think might well have liked to have come today but were deterred by the weather, they won't be able to hear the questions properly. So have we questions?
John Farmer, no affiliation. Would you perhaps put back your early slide on anaphylaxis and say more about what it is? I was interested, partly I admit as a first aider, not least for your long list of symptoms, but it would be helpful to have more background to what the condition actually is, even if you don't digress into treatment, because it does obviously need medical intervention. Thank you.
Yes. I mean, it's obviously different if you're treating children, but people who know they've got a food allergy, they may well have felt some of these symptoms before. And what's amazing is how they often react. I have a friend who is a mother of 4 children, and she has very bad fish allergy. And she went to the pub, and she knew she was starting to have an allergic reaction. So what she did was she went to the toilet. She left her handbag with her EpiPen, with her friends, and she then proceeded to throw up and all sorts of things and practically collapsed in the toilet unattended. And she had a number of these, you know, hives, flush. She didn't have asthma, but sense of impending doom and the alteration in heart rate. And this is not uncommon. There are many people who, teenagers, particularly teenage boys, young men, are really vulnerable to this if they've got a severe reaction. They often don't carry their pens. So there are calls that in first aid boxes in public places and especially in schools that there should be adrenaline pens. But of course then people need to know how to use them, and I have been at allergy meetings where there have been some graphic photographs of misuse of adrenaline pens, including people injecting them the wrong way and getting it going all the way through their fingers. And in the people who die, and this is a very serious thing from a point of view of a first aider, that you should know how to use it, because sometimes people die because they either didn't have their pen, they didn't use it properly, it was expired, and there are also issues with how long the needle is, because if you have someone who is overweight, it's very important that the adrenaline goes into the muscles, and if you've got too much subcutaneous fat, it may be that the needle is not long enough to get in. So I think there are a number of issues, but it's about having prompt medication there. And I think this happens very, very rapidly, can happen within a space of minutes. So I think it's probably far better if you do know that somebody's about to have one, that you get medication to them promptly.
Could I just ask a quick supplementary? Are you saying that people prone to this tend to have a pen with them, and therefore, in a first aider role, one should look for it? Is it, in essence, just a matter of a determined injection, or is there more to it than that?
The anaphylaxis campaign in the UK, who represents the severely allergic patients, spend a lot of time and effort in training their members and their family members in using adrenaline pens. And that is also about carrying it with you. But there are all sorts of issues around this, like they're expensive, sometimes they only get prescribed one. There are all sorts of other issues around that, but they should have an adrenaline pen. However, I was at a workshop in India, and we were actually with someone, the whole workshop had allergy as part of it, and this young lady had had a severe anaphylactic reaction when she was a child and had never been seen by a GP and didn't actually have an adrenaline pen, and actually realised that she was starting to have an allergic reaction sitting next to us, which was quite worrying. So there are all sorts of issues about people using the medication, but I don't think it's just allergies. You can see the same sort of thing in diabetics, especially young people.
Would you wait for the microphone?
Eva Grossman, retired teacher. Is there any indication of your studies, why is it that young people have so much more tendency to have this? My son has been severely allergic to a number of foods, and peanut is probably the worst. And it seemed to be that the peak was between 18 and about 25, and this seemed to have thankfully been improving since. I mean, if it's due to proteins, why is it that there is different reasons?
Okay, there's two aspects to an allergy. It's like, well, why are certain foods so much more of a problem? But there's the other part, which is the human being. And why do some people get allergies and not others? And the big question you're saying is, why is this? Why does somebody become allergic? And I think the short answer is, we don't really know. But having found out, for example, in our epidemiology studies, that there are parts of the world where genuinely they have much, much lower rates of allergy than we have, it does point to things in our environment. And there is something called the hygiene hypothesis, and it may relate to food allergies, but also other kinds of allergies like asthma, allergic asthma, that it's to do with changes in our environment and exposure to microbes early on in life. There is another idea that skin barrier function, because we found certain genes that affect the integrity of the skin barrier early in life, may also affect the way in which people get sensitized. But this is something that the allergy community are very active in researching. There is another hypothesis that it could be to do with the foods that you eat. And maybe, is it all of them? So we don't know, but we have a number of ideas that we're investigating to find out.
Claire, could I ask a supplement to that? In your studies, did you look at socioeconomic class? Because that might have given some triggers to indicate what might be causing it.
We haven't finished doing the data analysis in EuroPrevall, but I do believe that there is data that may point to actually more affluent middle classes being potentially more prone than others.
Peter Smart, RSC member. You showed some rather strange-looking geographical homogeneities for food allergies. Is it known whether there's similar, perhaps even matching phenomena for non-food allergies?
I think it's slightly different, but there are differences in the patterns and incidence of other types of inhalant allergy. Although, in the immortal words of the epidemiologist who led us in part of the EuroPrevall study, who's done a lot of work, Peter Burney, in places like Africa, he's always said, well, there's no shortage of allergen. And one of the interesting things in some of the studies he's done in Africa is that people do get sensitized. So they make the IgE molecule, but somehow they don't necessarily manifest their allergy. I have another slide where we've also done that. A colleague in the Netherlands, Ronald van Ree, looking at peanut. In Indonesia, there's a huge number of people who are making IgE to peanut, but they don't have peanut allergy. So there are some things that seem to have to be there to enable you to actually manifest the allergy.
Mark Friedman, Thank you. Mark Friedman, researcher in autoimmune syndromes, RSC member. The prevalence of the allergies, is it homogeneous across ethnic boundaries?
Sorry, is it homogeneous across ethnic boundaries?
Yes.
It's quite difficult sometimes to tease out differences in ethnicity and differences in environment. But there have been studies that have been done with Israelis and Jews in Israel and in the UK. And actually, it looks like environment is a very important part of this, actually. And there is some anecdotal evidence that, for example, South Asians, if they come to the UK when they're older, they keep their low allergy rates, if you like, of being in India. But if they migrate early in life, when they're young children, very young children, actually they can end up being allergic like the rest of the community. Those data are very thin on the ground, but that is what the indications are it might be. The environment has a very, very important role to play in how people respond. I mean, our genes haven't changed in the UK, particularly over the last 30 years, but we do see much more allergy than we perhaps used to.
Do we know any comparable data for those of sub-Saharan African ethnicity?
I don't know about sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, we've done the studies in Ghana, and you see where in Ghana what you see are differences between rural and urban environments. And when you get urbanization, you see increases in all sorts of allergic disease. But this is, you know, you also have a lot of changes in socioeconomic group. You have lifestyle changes, what people are eating. And everything. They may live in clean houses and they don't. One hypothesis has been parasitic infections have a role, you know. But what would you rather have, the parasites or the allergies? I mean...
Thank you very much.
John Farmer again. Would you say more about celiac disease? I'm generally familiar with it, having negotiated restaurant meals to take account of a sufferer's needs. But how common is it, and what do we know about its causes, and anything else that occurs to you on the subject? Thank you.
Well, I'm not an expert on celiac disease, so I can't tell you off the top of my head how many people suffer from celiac disease. But the toxic, if you like, component in food is gluten, which comes from wheat. And there are proteins in the gluten that cause celiac disease. And there are similar proteins in related cereals like barley and rye. So often that's why people with celiac disease have to avoid those as a group. But they can usually tolerate oats because oats don't contain the same protein fraction.
My name is Frank Grossman. In a previous existence, I was involved with work-related health, although I'm not a health specialist. There are interesting resonances in what you've said about allergies with respiratory problems. And I wonder if you might like to say something about possible, not a relationship, but about, let's say, a resonance between.
Well, there are an awful lot of people who have, a lot of the people who have food allergy also have asthma, may have allergic asthma. Many of them have some of them have multiple allergies, multiple food allergies, but they may also have pollen allergy, they might be allergic to dust mite. And there is a sense in which actually the people with food allergies represent almost one of the most allergic groups, because they often have all these, particularly adults, older adults, who start developing things like pollen allergy. And there is something called the atopic march, although that there's a progression from infantile eczema through to asthma, and there do appear to be some connections and relationships, but I don't think that they are fully understood. And there's been work done in Manchester where they've been really trying to dissect what they call atopy, using new methods to try and classify it, because atopy is a very broad term, and within that there may be lots of different types of allergic condition which may actually have a different disease pathway. So we're now probably at a stage where we can dissect these out and understand and treat it better than we have done before.
Again, following up a little bit on that, Claire, many years ago, our GP had this idea about dealing with hay fever. And she said that all of us have the potential for allergic reaction, which of course is what you're saying tonight, but that food allergy was very important in contributing to that. And she used to say to people who had suffered from hay fever, don't have any milk protein throughout the spring and the summer when the pollen is high. Then your total dose of allergens is kept down, because we all have some allergy to foreign proteins. Is that a viable theory?
I'm not sure that we would understand it in quite that way, in that actually our bodies are surrounded by all sorts of challenges, from the food we eat, the air we breathe, everything. And this concept that you're surrounded by things that could potentially be allergens. So, and generally speaking, certainly as far as cow's milk is concerned, it is very unusual for adults to have cow's milk allergy of the type that I have described. They tend to be a very special group, and sometimes they are actually very severely allergic, but they are a very small number of people. In EuroPrevall, we actually ended up with people perceived that they have cow's milk allergy, and that may be because as a child they did have it, and they may never have had a proper diagnosis that says it's resolved and it's gone away. So I think that's where some of these ideas about dairy products people being allergic may come from.
Just a question. Laura Cadon, a science student. I would like to know if the size of the protein RH2 could have an influence, with the permeability of the duodenum.
Okay, it may well do, and it may also be that the properties of the protein scaffold affect the way it can be taken up by cells. But they're difficult sorts of experiments to actually do, but it's a very interesting idea.
Are there any more questions this evening? Because I think we've had a truly excellent talk and some very nice, lively discussion. Therefore, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to, first of all, wish you all a safe journey home. Thank you so much for coming to this, and hope that this talk tonight will attract you to come back to this wonderful building, the Royal Society of Chemistry, to one of the other public lectures. But of course, the main thing that I have to do is to ask you to thank again Clare for this excellent evening. Many thanks, Clare.